Midway Games was a prominent American video game developer and publisher founded in 1988. The company was responsible for creating some of the most iconic and influential arcade games of the 1990s, including Mortal Kombat, NBA Jams, and Cruising USA. Midway Games was known for the emphasis on fast-paced, over-the-top action and their innovative use of digital graphics and sound. In addition to their arcade games, Midway also developed and published games for home consoles, such as the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. Despite experiencing financial troubles in the 2000s, Midway Games remains a beloved and influential company in the history of video gaming. I'm Professor Retro, and this is What Happened to Midway Games. Before we begin on what happened, we need to go on to how this all began. Midway began as Midway Manufacturing in 1958, founded by Henry Ross and Maureen Wellington, making amusement equipment. In 1969, Midway was then purchased by slot machine maker Bally. After years of making mechanical-style games, Midway moved on to making arcade games. In the 70s, Midway had ties with Japanese video game giant Taito, distributing games to the U.S. Midway's biggest success at the time came in 1978 with the licensing of Taito's arcade hit Space Invaders, followed by Namco's Pac-Man and Mrs. Pac-Man in 1982. That same year, Bally merged their pinball division with Midway, and thus Bally Midway was born, and 3 new games came out with a Bally Midway name on it. Bally Midway soon decided to buy up all of Sega's assets from Gulf and Western Industries, which then gave them distribution rights to arcade games made by Sega such as Astron Belt, Flicky, Super Spy, and Up and Down. In 1988, Bally Midway was purchased by arcade and pinball company Williams Electronic Games through their holding company WMS Industries, who changed the name back to Midway Manufacturing and moved from Franklin Park, Illinois to Chicago. However, during all of this, all but 2 designers were let go. The 2 who stayed were Rampage creators Brian Collins and Jeff Newman. In 1991, Midway absorbed Williams' video game division and stopped using the Bally Midway label, with the Addams Family pinball game being a big hit. In 1996, WMS made a public offering of Midway stocks and transferred all their copyrights and trademarks to Midway, which included Defender, Robotron 2048, and Joust. In 1998, after WMS spun off 86.8% interest in Midway to their shareholders, making Midway an independent entity for the first time in 30 years. In 1999, Midway stopped making pinball machines and changed their Atari Games subsidiary to Midway Games West to avoid confusion with Atari Interactive. On June 22, 2001, Midway announced the closure of their arcade division due to the decline in the arcade market, and 2 years later they closed Midway Games West. Over those years, Midway kept losing, and in 2003 they lost $115 million on sales of $93 million. Even though they were losing funds, they barely managed to stay afloat due to stock and debt offerings until Summer Redstone, a significant Midway minority shareholder, began to increase his stake in the company and soon owned 80% of Midway. In 2004, in an effort to expand, Midway began on a purchasing spree, buying up developers such as Surreal Software, Paradox Development, and Radfake Games, and renamed themselves Midway Studio, only to close it up 4 years later. On December 15th, Midway Studios was shut down for good. However, on February 15th, 2005, Midway agrees to make games for Cartoon Network based off their Cartoon Network properties, which included Adult Swim at the time. Midway lost more between 2007 and 2008 to the tunes of $77 million and $100 million in sales alone. In 2007, Midway was in a legal battle with Mind Shadow Entertainment over the game Psyops. Mind Shadow claimed Midway copied the story from a script they had from a client. However, on December 2, 2008, the court ruled in Midway's favor, saying there was no evidence of copyright infringement. In March 2007, Midway entered a debt agreement with National Amusement, which at the time was owned by, you guessed it, Summer Redstone. Midway CEO David Zucker claimed that Unreal Tournament 3 was going to set them up for a great 2008. He resigned, however, on March 21, 2008, making him the 3rd CEO to resign in 4 years. To further cut costs, Midway closed down 2 more studios, the Los Angeles and Austin studios, leaving only 4 left. 1 in Chicago, 1 in Seattle, 1 in San Diego, and 1 in Newcastle, England. During this time, Midway released TNA Impact and Bliss League 2 in their LA studios before they got shut down. In November 2008, Midway announced that the cash and the resources they had left wasn't adequate enough to fund anything at all, and had to cut more costs, and on November 22, 2008, Midway received a letter from the New York Stock Exchange delisting them due to their stock price falling below $1. Midway's last game was Mortal Kombat vs. DC. In 2008, Warner Bros. Offered a takeover bid of $33 million to acquire most of Midway's assets, which included Seattle and Chicago studios and the right to Mortal Kombat vs. DC. This did not include, however, the San Diego studios and the Newcastle studios, and the TNA Impact series. On May 28, 2008, Midway started to accept bidding offers up to June 24th of that same year, then followed by an auction. However, since there were no bidders other than Warner Bros., the auction was canceled. And on July 1st, 2009, Midway filed bankruptcy and most of the company's assets went to Warner Bros. Soon Midway started to close more of their studios, starting with San Diego, which THQ bought it for $7,400,000. And on July 14th, 2009, Midway closed up the Newcastle studio. On October of 2009, a judge dismissed a case stating that Midway had lied to their shareholders while selling their stock, and on June 29, 2010, the bankruptcy court dismissed a claim of fraud and breach of duty against Summer Redstone. On February of 2010, Midway filed a proposed plan of liquidation with the bankruptcy court, and on June 9, 2010, Midway filed the Form 15 with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which terminated their public registration. Finally, on March of 2011, any remaining assets were dissolved, thus putting the final nail in Midway's coffin. Despite its success, Midway Games struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing video game market, and the company ultimately declared bankruptcy in 2009. Although Midway's legacy lives on through the continued popularity of its games, its demise serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of staying ahead of the curve in a constantly evolving industry. What do you remember about Midway Games? Let me know in the comments. And with that, remember to mash that like button, ring that bell, and smash that subscribe button so you get the heads up of when my next video goes up. Until then, I'm Professor Retro saying class is over, and peace out and stay frosty.